Yes, we should be recording now. Okay, so let me try not to waste as much time as possible and try to go through a quick summary of these two chapters. Then we can get into discussion. Okay, let me present. All right, here we go. You guys just let me know if there's something up and something freezes up, something goes wrong. You just let me know. Okay, Joshua 7 and 8, Israel and I. All right, so we start off with a defeat, which is very strange because a people who has God on their side should not be defeated by such a small city as Ai, especially after all the victories that Israel has been going through. They had such a supernatural victory at Jericho. So Jericho was the previous city that they conquered. And that was done so supernaturally. The big walls around Jericho came crumbling down, and Israel, the underdog, came in and just, won the victory because God was with them. So, how does such a successful group of people like Israel cower before a tiny city like Ai? The thing was, all the Canaanites, which include Jericho, Ai, all these cities that God is leading Israel to conquer, they were all afraid of Israel, who were ex-slaves from Egypt, Israel, who had no idea how to fight battles. They're not a warring people. They don't know how to fight. These people who were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, what makes them so special? But all these Canaanites were afraid of Israel. It literally says that their hearts were melting in fear when they were hearing about all the things, all the feats that God, the living God, was doing through Israel, and they were afraid. They were like, if Israel comes against us, what's going to happen? If Israel comes against us, we're totally done for. But here, the tiny city Ai, which was supposed to be light work, was not so. Ai gave Israel an embarrassing defeat. So, what's the reason? The reason is because Israel broke faith with God by having objects from Jericho that were devoted to destruction hidden in the camp. Now, Achan did not confess, did not let anybody know that he had done this sin. When Israel attacked Jericho, right? Or rather, when God won that victory in Jericho for Israel by making the walls around Jericho come down, Israel went in and killed all the inhabitants of Jericho. And God had told them specifically not to take any of the plunder for themselves. If any gold or any, precious sort of metal was taken, that was supposed to be put in God's treasury for God's purposes. They were supposed to take something for themselves. But Israel broke faith in that matter because of what Achan did secretly. So, but again, remember, when the chapter starts, nobody in Israel is aware of the fact of what Achan did. They're ready to fight this battle. They're like, we're going to win this. This is light work. This is easy. This is a breeze. We're going to get through this and move on to the next challenge. So Joshua sends spies. Remember, Joshua is the one who is leading Israel now. He is Moses' successor. Joshua sends spies to Ai to scout it out, and the spies come back and tell Joshua that it's a very small threat, and they did not have to bring the whole army out. They just needed only 2,000 to 3,000 men, and the job would get done. But Israel suffered an embarrassing defeat, which caused them to fear. Almost 36 Israelites died in that embarrassing defeat, and afterwards everybody was afraid. Joshua, the elders, the warriors who came back, all of Israel was afraid because of, it's scary because what happens when the rest of the surrounding Canaanites hear of your embarrassing defeat? That means they're going to come in and think, hey, why were we even scared of these people in the first place? Let's attack them. Let's all gang up and destroy this joke of a people. They're not strong after all. So this strikes fear into the heart of Israel, and they cry out to God for mercy, for help. Joshua finally consults in God's presence. So he falls before the altar of God until the evening time, waiting for a response from the Lord as to why Israel was defeated. Joshua communicates his fear to God for that whatever was hindering their victory to be revealed. And God tells him, hey, get up, get up, hear this. This is why you were defeated. It's because the things devoted to destruction from Jericho are still being kept in your camp. If things devoted to destruction are kept in the camp, if things that are defiled and unholy are kept in the camp, I can't be there, God is saying, right? Because now the rest of us, we've been hearing this for a while, but for our new friends who are here today, one motif of a word that we're going to be hearing a lot in the Old Testament is covenant. Covenant means a friendship and an ally, like being an ally with God, forming like a connection. And maybe there's a better word for this, and if you guys have a better word, put it in the chat. But like it's this partnership with God, the living God. Why does God try to form a partnership with his creation, with this people, right? It's because God loved these people so much and he wanted a nation for himself, a nation that he could call his people, and that people could call God their God. That relationship, that intimate relationship and friendship, God wanted that with these people. But and to further add, God is not just making the covenant with them. God is saying, I will dwell in your midst. God already has his throne in heaven. God is worshipped 24/7. He's the creator of the universe. What need does he have to have his presence dwell among mere humans? But that's how much God was invested into this covenant relationship. So the reason the Israelites were winning these victories was because God's presence was dwelling in their camp. But one thing to remember is that God's presence cannot dwell in a place that's not holy. That he simply can't. That it's not aligned. He cannot compromise who he is. God is the holy of holies, right? He cannot dwell in a place that's not holy. So the fact that these things devoted to destruction were hidden in Israel's camp, God could not stay there. But the thing is, none of the Israelites knew that God's presence wasn't there because they didn't consult God before this easy battle. The battle was supposed to be easy, but that was because God was supposed to be with them, not because of any of their own strength. And that's proven here, right? This is not about Israel's own strength. This is not about Israel's capabilities, because if it was, Israel should have defeated this tiny city. But Israel has just gone through this embarrassing defeat, showing that, hey, it's not about numbers. Don't, Israel was never supposed to think that it was all that, because it wasn't. The reason why it was winning these victories was because of God, God's presence with them. He was the one who was giving them victory. All right, moving on. So after this defeat, God reveals, it's not that God was waiting for the defeat to reveal what was going on to them. They did not consult God before rushing into battle, thinking, we got this, we can overpower them. But we can talk more about that in the discussion. Achan sinned. So God reveals that he could not be with his people unless the things devoted to destruction were removed. God instructs consecration, which is basically being set apart, purifying yourself, and to cast lots to find the man who committed the sin against God's covenant. Achan confesses his sin after the lot falls on him. And he claims that he confesses that he was tempted by a beautiful cloak, 200 shekels of silver, and a gold bar from Jericho. And he took those secretly and hid them in his tent, dug it up in a hole under his tent. Nobody knew. So a judgment against Achan was enacted as he, his household, his belongings, right, his livestock, and the devoted things that he took were stoned to death and burned at the valley of Achan, right? If you take a step back, you're like, oh, that's a little gory. That's a little extreme, right? But we're going to be talking about that in discussion. What does it mean to compromise God's holiness? How does that affect? How does that affect you? How does that affect your household? How does that affect the people around you? Because all of Israel suffered from that defeat because of this sin, because of how these things devoted to destruction. If you hold on to things that are devoted to destruction, hey, apply it to today. If you hold on to habits, to objects, to people, things that are devoted to destruction, things that you should not be holding close or hiding in your heart, things that are defiled and causing you to be defiled, it's causing God's presence to not be able to be with you. It's not that God doesn't want to be with you. He's like, please, the reason I told you not to take these things is because I want to stay in your presence. I want to give you the victory. But if you hold on to these things, I can't stay here because that's compromising my holiness. All right, moving on. The fall of Ai. Eventually, after these things that were devoted to destruction were destroyed and judgment was enacted upon Achan, God's presence is able to come within Israel again. And God encourages Joshua. And when I say Israel, I mean the people of Israel, not the place. They haven't been given a place yet. They're literally conquering Canaan to have a place of their own. God encourages Joshua that he has given the enemy into their hands and gives them a battle strategy to follow through with. He's not saying, hey, figure it out, you fight on your own. No, he's giving Israel the specifics, the details, the strategy that they need to win this battle. So Israel follows through with the ambush plan that God gives them. And the reason I put these maps up here is to just give you an idea of, sometimes we read the verses and we're like, what are they talking about? It's hard to visualize and have that sort of strategy illustrated. But basically, if you were able to follow along with it, it's pretty complex for inexperienced warriors. Like I mentioned before, these people are not trained in war like these other cities like Egypt and Jericho, where they've been training their warriors from a young age. These people don't know what they're doing. Like, they're not warriors. They're not people who are accustomed with war. So how do they receive? How are they able to fight this? It's because God is on their side. God is giving them the calls. God is giving them the plans. Anyways, we see that they're divided into three parts, right? Joshua and the main force, the main group, they're right where the people of Ai can see them, and then there are two other battalions, two other groups that are cornering Ai from the back, but Ai does not see, the people of Ai don't know about those two other groups ambushing. So when they see Joshua and the main force, pretend to be defeated, pretend to be retreating, right? And so the people from Ai chase after Joshua and the Israelites, to chase them and to overwhelm them and to destroy them once and for all. And they chase Joshua and the Israelites, but that's when the two forces from behind the city come into the city while there's no there's no protection in it, and they overwhelm the city. They set the city on fire, and when the people of Ai, who are chasing after Joshua and the main force, turn around and see the city, the smoke billowing from the city on fire, they are left stranded, because at that point the two forces are in the city now, and Joshua and the main force are in front of Ai now. They've been surrounded completely. That's how they won this victory at Ai. So Ai was devoted to destruction except for livestock and plunder. In this case, God gave Israel permission to take livestock and plunder for themselves. In the case of Jericho, God did not give them permission to take anything as plunder for themselves. And the city is burned, and the king of Ai is hung, and basically Ai is reduced to a pile of ruin. All right, the two chapters end out. Chapter 8 ends with covenant renewal. So basically, in Deuteronomy, in the book of Deuteronomy, which we just finished, God spoke to Moses about how when the Israelites, God spoke to Moses before they crossed the river Jordan, before they actually stepped foot into the promised land. God was giving Moses these last minute instructions that the Israelites needed to remember, so that once they crossed the Jordan, they could worship God and they could renew this covenant in the way that God wanted them to renew. So here, Moses is not here to follow through with those things that God said, right? Joshua obeys everything that the Lord spoke through Moses regarding what to do to remember the covenant. He built an altar of uncut stones, meaning there was no human influence, there was no human sort of artisanship, because for those who weren't here, we went through the whole process of the Israelites making the altar, the tabernacle of God, all these fancy, intricate, ornate things that God wanted them to build to set up the tabernacle, the ark of God, the place of worship. But in this case, this altar was not supposed to be built with any fancy schmancy gold, or they have to cut really fancy patterns and beautiful things. And so no, this altar was built with uncut stones. They had to put together unaltered, uninvolved stones and build that altar, and offer burnt and peace offerings. In the Old Testament, you're going to see different types of offerings: burnt offerings, peace offerings, sin offerings. So we've already gone through them. If you guys are still trying to learn more about it, highly encourage you guys to ask questions, and hopefully in the near future we'll be able to revisit those things. But each of those sacrifices point to, basically foreshadow things that Jesus did for us, how Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice for us. But basically, I think I forgot to mention that every time we go through these chapters in the Old Testament, we see how Jesus was plan A all along. He is foreshadowed in the Old Testament. All the different types, all the different forms of worship that Israel does, the covenant, everything about it, all these things point to Jesus. And we're able to make those connections as we read through the Old Testament. But back to the point. So a copy of the law that God gave to Israel through Moses is written down on plastered stones and is read out before the whole congregation, towards the whole people of Israel. Everybody in the camp, sorry, I spelled heard wrong, embarrassing, but everybody in Israel heard the law read out to them, both the blessing and the curse, which they could choose from. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 27, I'm not going to go back to it, but God is saying, hey, you are able to choose. You are given free will to choose. Hey, if you follow this law, if you uphold this covenant, then these blessings will be given to you. If you don't follow this law, if you don't follow this covenant, you have the freedom to choose, right? But you are part of this covenant. So understand that if you are not faithful to the covenant, like how I'm faithful to the covenant, God is saying, then the consequences of that is this curse. And I don't want you to be cursed. God is saying, you are my people. I want you to be blessed. So choose today whether you want the blessing or the curse. Choose today who you serve. So none of the law was left out. It makes a point to say that Joshua did not leave anything out from the law. He put all of it down, and he read it to the whole assembly: men, women, children, elders, priests, sojourners. Sojourners referring to the people who aren't actually born as Israelites, people who were conquered, if they were conquered from other cities that Israel conquered, people who are in Israel, not as Israelites, but people who are serving Israel. They were not left out from enjoying the benefits of this covenant. They too could serve this God. In a couple of chapters ago, we talked about Rahab. Rahab was a prostitute woman from Jericho who had no way of salvation, but she and her household were preserved from judgment and destruction. And now she is part of Israel. As a sojourner, she too has a claim on this covenant. She too can have a covenant with this God despite not being Israel. All right, so that concludes the presentation. Sorry that it wasn't as quick as I thought it was going to be. I honestly, you guys are going to see how quickly time travels when we're in these Bible studies. It's already 6:47, so I'm not going to waste any more time. If you guys have questions or connections, something that reminds you of something that we've read before, I'm talking to the guys that are usually weekly sort of here, but also to the new guys here. If there's something that you don't be ashamed to ask questions that you probably would be ashamed to ask at church, or you think, oh, they're going to think I don't believe in God if I ask this question, or they're going to think that I'm doubting the word. No, whatever questions that you have, ask, and we'll delve into the word and answer it together. The Holy Spirit will reveal it to us. So yeah, without further ado, if anybody has any points to mention, any questions, any connections, anything, the floor is open.
I'll get us started. I just want to talk about Joshua chapter 7, verses 7, where it says, And Joshua said, Sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring this people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. This reminded me of how the Israelites was complaining when they were in the wilderness escape from Egypt. If you look at Exodus 14, verse 12 to 14, it says, we said, leave us alone, let us be the slaves to the Egyptians. It's better to be a slave in Egypt than a corpse in the wilderness. And it kind of reminded me of how, like, whenever we are faced with obstacles or troubles in life, we often complain or point fingers or even blame it on God. But like, in order to taste and see like the glory of God, to see like what He has planned for us, we need to be able to get through that like difficult paths in life, in order to get the salvation, the peace, and the joy that He has planned for us. Because to get to that salvation, peace, and joy, it's not always a smooth road. So we need to put like our complete faith in God, our complete trust in Him, and ask Him before like we do anything.
Ask Him before we. That's a beautiful thought, Reba. First of all, trust Him, and also ask Him before you do anything, because we could assume, hey, it doesn't give us, like, it doesn't spell out Joshua's mindset right now, but we can assume, hey, after all the victories that he's seen, he still trusts in God, but he's like, hey, easy money, you know? I is such a small city. We've got this. Like he probably thought, hey, even if I consult God, I'm still gonna, I'm still gonna get the same answer. He's just gonna say, I'm with you, and we're gonna have this. Let me just spare God the trouble. Let me save God's time and just go fight and get the victory. Hey, Joshua was we see a flaw here, right? Where Joshua did not consult God beforehand, because if he had, God would have been able to say, don't fight, because the things devoted to destruction are in your camp. You won't get victory if you fight with defiled things in your camp. But no one had the opportunity to hear that warning because no one consulted God before fighting. So a message to apply is, don't underestimate the enemy. Okay. You might think, hey, this temptation or this struggle that I'm going through, this is cake compared to the things that I've seen before. I'll just get through this. I don't really need to consult with God. It's okay. He already knows my heart. I already know what he's going to say. So I'll get through this and it's going to be okay. I'll talk to God once I've won the victory. That's a mistake, because you don't know how perhaps something is missing, something is lacking, something is wrong, but you don't know because you didn't consult with God before. So you're underestimating the enemy. Yes, you're supposed to conquer that enemy naturally, but because you're underestimating him because of something that a deeper problem within you before you get to fight, an enemy that you're supposed to overcome is overcoming you. And that shouldn't be, but it is, because you didn't consult with God. But yeah, beautiful, beautiful thought. Beautiful thought. Reba, for the guys who are just joining us today, maybe you are familiar with this already. I don't know, but just in case you aren't, when the Israelites were following Moses in the wilderness, heading to the promised land, these guys were complaining every other chapter. They're like, oh, why did you bring us out of Egypt? Egypt was so much better. Now look at us. We're struggling. Bro, stop. You have a covenant with the true and living God. Why do you think you won't be provided for? They're doubting God. Oh, we're going to die here. We're going to die here. Stop. God has provided for you. God has given this victory into your hands. Don't doubt him. If something is going wrong, realize God has already proven himself to you time and time again. God will never stop being who he is. We can, though. We can stop our faithfulness towards God, which becomes a chain reaction, which becomes the reason why we go through defeats that we're not supposed to go through. But know that God doesn't change his character. He remains the same. You can trust in him and his promises. Beautiful thought, Reba. Anything else? Remember, questions are open too. Something that didn't make sense, something that needs to be clarified further, something that you can connect to things that we read before, or things from the New Testament, things from Jesus's time, or things that are from the epistles, right? Like the letters that Paul wrote. Anything that you can, something that reminds you of something else, or something that you can apply into your own life, something that you were convicted by, which means, the Holy Spirit's like, hey, doesn't this remind you of something else about your life that you can connect this to, that you can use this for? Anything at all, guys? Oh yeah, go ahead.
I just want to once again like bring up the history that I've brought up before in our meetings before, and why God's judgment existed in that land. Because like if you like me, I do a lot of research into like history about like theological Bible, like things like why did God judge them the way that he did? The thing is that we can see that, God, God has righteous judgment. That's the single fact you have to remember throughout this, and then you can compare the different types of judgments he gave. Look, there's places like Sodom and Gomorrah and these cities that got entirely destroyed. And why is that? It's because they were full of like the worst things you could possibly find, because you can even find archaeological evidence for that. Because if you what is it? A few months ago, I was reading into this and apparently, what is it? Okay, so in Canaan is modern day Palestine. So if you look at ancient Palestine, what were the practices there? You can archaeology found that there were literally jars with infant remains left in there, infant remains in jars because that was one of their practices. And you could find at a mountaintop they had like some bronze leftovers. So basically the god that they would worship, Baal and Ashtaroth, they would basically, so Baal was like burning bronze. Like Baal's hand is out like that. It's like Baal's hand is out like that, and it's like he's on fire. And then basically, it was basically like a purification, right, for the ancient Palestinians. So basically, you like I'm saying this so bluntly because like it sounds like crazy, but I'm saying bluntly for the fact so you understand why judgment happens in the Old Testament. Look, so as usually when people of that land, whenever they got something new, or if they had got a new house, they settled a new tent for blessing of their house or their household, they would take the baby, they would put that onto the burning hand of Baal, and the baby's crying, of course, and dying, right? It's like the baby's literally melting away, the skin's melting away. Baby's like literally, and then basically it's designed in a way that as the baby is ruining away, it goes down his hand and gets put into a jar. And so basically, and also the woman, the mother, and like the family, right? They're not allowed to mourn over it. They're dancing and praising while that happens and happy because if you aren't happy during it, the pure that right doesn't work. Those rights don't work unless you're not if you're mourning, those rights won't work. And so basically that kid, the remains get poured into a jar and they would take that jar and put it in their house at the corners of their houses as protection for their houses from Baal and Ashtaroth. And okay, that's from just Baal. If you look at Ashtaroth, what would they do? Though they had rape offerings. Little children and women, they would rape them against their will. They would take them and forcibly do that because that's pleasing to Ashtaroth and that is blessing and it means fertility and it also means what is it? That they would get rich. That's what that showed. That's why Palestine was decimated the way it was. And if you look in Leviticus, the sin of the land had filled. If you look at Genesis, God stops them. God doesn't allow them to take that land. Why? Because God says their sin hasn't reached to the point of judgment yet. God won't judge you if your sin is not there. God won't judge you if you don't have the sin worthy of judgment because he prevented them from like going against the Amorites. He was like, I will bring you back. He prophesied, showed them prophecy showing that 400 years later you will come to this land and take it because these people will become corrupt. It's because that's what started happening. And God is not impartial either. I mean, God is impartial. The thing is that, if we also found these archaeological evidence. If you look at Jerusalem, a town near Jerusalem called what is it? Get it? It's my gosh, I forgot the name of it. I'm looking. I had this on a doc. I studied this and I had it on a doc a few months ago. But something starting with a G, Genes. I don't think it's Gennesaret. I don't think it's that. Oh, it's Gehenna. It's Gehenna. So there's a surrounding town near Jerusalem. It's Gehenna. It's in Israel. At a time later on, Israel started doing those same practices Palestinians did, ancient Palestinians. They would sacrifice their babies and literally like pour them into a jar and literally keep it in their houses. Those things were happening in Palestine, and that's why they were judged the way they were. Because if you look at Egypt, Egypt was not decimated because Egypt was more civilized than these people were. God has righteous judgment. Like God judges accordingly because Egypt didn't get decimated the way Palestine did. Why? It's because Egypt, you can look at history of Egypt. We have so much remains of that. We can see that that was more of a civilized organization than these other places were. And the thing is that also God says also like a thing that I thought about but I showed you why these people get judged the way they do. But this is completely like this is another idea, another aspect of it. Sometimes I wondered how would these people would these people just not go to heaven? Like, especially the people who are outside Israel or outside the Middle East. And I was like, are they just not going to have God and they just won't go to heaven? No. If you look at, no, I found the answer. In Romans 2, it says that God gives every man their own conscience, which is your morals, your morality. And the people who don't have the law, people who don't have God, the people who didn't get to know God at the time and have the law of God, they will be judged by their own morality, what they have done, because that is a law to themselves, which God has given them. Their conscience also accounts to God. So that's why things happened the way they did.
I'm thankful, Kill, that you brought that up, because it becomes easy when you don't have the context to see all the conquering that Israel is doing and take a step back and think, is God just giving Israel permission to just conquer and colonize these places just because they're his people? Not true. God is impartial. God is a righteous judge. And we see Caleb mentioned Leviticus chapters 18 and 19. If you guys are curious, you can go back and read. Are filled with the sins and the practices that these people, when Caleb says Palestinians, he means the ancient people who inhabited that land. So current day, that area we know as like Palestine and other places as well. But in those days, those are the people who are known as the Canaanites. So the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites. Those are the people that God is saying your time is up in this land because I've given you chances to repent. I've given you chances to not revel in the sin, but you continue. So the phrase that's used is the land on which you're living is literally vomiting you out because it's not able to sustain you anymore because of the sins that you are doing that are hated by God. God also turns around in Leviticus 18 and 19. He's explaining to his people, Israel, why they have the space to enter Canaan. Listen, if the Canaanites were not doing these sins, if their sins had not reached that level of judgment yet, they would not have been destroyed. God would not have told Israel to go and conquer these people. God would have made another place for Israel. But because their sin had reached that level and beyond that level, the land was literally like, no more. And that was why Israel was able to conquer. God turns around because Caleb says God is impartial, meaning he has no partiality, no favoritism. God's not saying, to Israel, the Israelites, I don't care what you do. You can do whatever you want in this land. I really don't care. No, God is saying, if I'm warning you, if you do things to break the covenant, if you do the immoral, the degenerate sins that the people before you who lived in this land do, then the land will vomit you out as well. Covenant or no covenant, the land will vomit you out as well. It's going to be a whole lot more tragic because you guys are people of the covenant and I've given you this promise, but know that I'm not impartial. Having a covenant with me doesn't mean you can do whatever you want willy-nilly and I'm not going to say anything because God is still a righteous God, a righteous judge. So yeah, that's just a background as to why we're seeing why is Israel attacking cities left and right, because they're claiming this inheritance that God is giving them because the people who were living in them before just engaged in so much sin that it was time for judgment upon them. Thank you for bringing that up, Caleb. Anything else? Okay, so if we were to deconstruct these two chapters verse by verse, there is so much to go through. We never have time within that 1 hour span to get through everything. So there's so much. This is just us skimming the surface. There's so much to explore. But is there anything that anyone wants to add? Anything about Achan? Maybe any questions or any sort of, hey, what was up with that? Any sort of a clarification needed with that, or anything at all? Hey, one thing to remember is Rahab, the woman that I just mentioned, the prostitute woman from Jericho, right? Jericho was a place that was devoted to destruction, right? One of the people who practiced these evil practices, their judgment time was up. The land was vomiting them out. That's why Israel had the permission to go in and conquer them. Rahab was still spared. So people who recognized God's sovereignty, even though they were not part of the people of Israel, they had a chance to be spared. They had a chance for salvation. Rahab did not have the law that the Israelites had, but she was able to recognize that this God is a real God. And if I put my trust in this God, I can be saved. I can be saved. And that's how she and her household were saved. So we see God's justice is so far beyond our understanding of justice. We only see our vision is like so, there's a word for it, like I don't know, but you guys know what I'm trying to say. Like it's so narrow. God is able to see the factors, see the things that we're not able to see or understand. So know that he is a God of mercy, as we can see from Rahab and her family who were spared, right? While everybody else in Jericho was destroyed. So yes, God is a righteous God. All right, last minute, holding out for anything else that anybody wants to mention. I will say that for Achan, sometimes questioning God's justice will be like, well, why was Achan's whole family destroyed with him, right? Achan, his household, his livestock, everything, right? Well, here's the thing. Oh, compared to Korah. So if you guys don't know who Korah is, we've studied about him. Korah was a man in Israel while they were headed to the promised land from the previous generation. He was a person who literally staged a coup, staged a rebellion against Moses and Aaron, asking, well, why did God put you in charge? You know, why are you, who made you guys the bosses, right? Basically staging a rebellion. And because of that rebellion, because God judged Korah and Dathan and Abiram, two other men with him, and all their households and everything that they had, and the earth literally swallowed them up, right? Where they stood. The earth swallowed them up. That was the judgment upon them. But later we see descendants of Korah survive. Okay? Yes, everything was taken, but somehow some descendants of Korah survived. They were not swallowed up. Either they escaped that judgment, right? Because they did not stand in allegiance with the sin of their father. They did not stand in allegiance, and they understood the sovereignty of God and that this sin should not be done. So they did not partake. They did not support. They ran away and sought the mercy of God. That's why they were not judged along with their father. So why were Achan's family brought to judgment? Well, think about it. If Achan stole from Jericho the cloak and the gold and everything, right? And he brought it back to his tent, and it says that he dug it up in a hole in his tent, and nobody else, no other Israelite, Joshua, no one knew about it, right? But how could his family not know? It's literally, they had to have seen him dig a hole in their home, in the tent, put all this stuff in there. He probably shared it with them too. I'm just taking this so that we can be well provided for, so we can have these things, just in case we need things. They saw this, they heard this, but they still kept it silence. They did not go tell somebody. They did not tell Joshua, fully knowing that God told them not to take any of the things devoted to destruction because of how that would be consequential to Israel. In his family, those in his household, his wife, perhaps his children, saw what Achan was doing, but nobody said anything. They aligned themselves with his sin. That is why they too were not exempt from that judgment. And nothing that had been defiled by those things, it could remain in the camp, because that would just put a mark, just like a curse upon Israel that would not give them the victory. God's presence could not dwell anywhere that's not holy. He cannot be compromised by unholiness. Yeah. So that's just some commentary there. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So you guys haven't had the pleasure of really digging into Joshua like we've been able to. It's 7:08 already. I promise I'm wrapping it up. Joshua was the one who was chosen to lead Israel after Moses died. That's a huge responsibility, right? Huge responsibility. So Joshua was chosen because how much he loved God. How much he loved God. Every year in our church, or every and it just goes into our Bible studies as well, we love to explore the Word of God with a certain lens, right? A certain lens through which to see the Word of God. Because just because we talked about these two chapters doesn't mean the story's done, doesn't mean this is all we can ever receive from these two chapters. There's just so much treasure within the Word of God. And when you can look at it through different lens and discover new truths, new meanings that are constantly applicable to your life. So this year, the message, the theme for our church is, this is a year of faith and faithfulness. And we're exploring everywhere in the Bible where it talks about exhibiting faith and faithfulness, growing in faith and faithfulness. And this month, a sort of like sub message from that bigger theme is, in order to grow in faith and faithfulness, you gotta love God. Last month in February, we talked about how in order to grow in faith and faithfulness, you have to draw close to God, draw close to God. And in order to draw close to God, in order to do it organically, authentically, genuinely, you need to love the God who you're drawing. You need to love God. You don't desire to be closer to somebody if you don't love them, you know? Like for real. You like really love them. So God is saying, in order to, in his word, he's showing us, in order to grow in faith and faithfulness, love me, right? That's what we see through the character of Joshua. Joshua loved God's presence, you know? Joshua was a person who just was so hungry for God's presence that he would wait, even when Moses, was done doing talking with God, communing with God, because God and Moses had a relationship like friends who would talk face to face. Like that's the bar that Moses set for a relationship with God. But even when Moses was done talking with God for the day, went back into the Israelite camp to do the rest of the Israelite duties or whatever else a leader had to do, Joshua would wait. Joshua would wait in the place where Moses was talking to God in the tent of meeting, and he would be like, man, I want that. I want that relationship with God. I want to be so close to God that I get to talk to him as with a friend. So we see Joshua is chosen for that. And that was the right choice, because we see in chapter 8, Joshua does not forget any of the law that God spoke through Moses. Joshua does not cherry pick, oh, I'll keep this much of the law. I don't forget, or I don't remember the rest, or maybe this part of the law is a little outdated. We can do without it. No, he remembered every single part of the law, because to him, it wasn't just a bunch of rules. To him, it was, this is what the God that I love commanded us so that we can stay in that covenant relationship. This was so much more than a bunch of rules to Joshua. And we see that, how he's able to shepherd these people time and time again. Hey, Joshua messed up. We read about that, right? We just talked about that. He didn't consult with God before the battle of Ai, right? And we saw the consequences of that. But after Joshua, after this defeat, right? And he falls before God's altar. That's the first place where he runs. He doesn't try to figure out the problem himself, right? The first thing that Joshua does is come before the altar of God and just come face down in reverence and ask God, why? Reveal yourself to us, right? And when God reveals the sin that is keeping the Israelites away from victory, Joshua doesn't stay on his face in the ground and what do we do? He doesn't stay in any sort of self-pity or like, oh, I messed up. What am I going to do now? No, he got up. He rose up early in the morning the next day to carry out what God told him to do. That's the relationship that Joshua had with God. That's the relationship that we can have with God as well. If you truly love God, hey, if you mess up, then he's the first person you're going to go to. If you mess up, and it's different than in the times of Joshua. In the times of Joshua, sacrifices had to be offered. Judgment had to be enacted in order for a sin to be removed, in order for you to be able to approach God again, in order for God's presence to be accessible to you again. But that's not so for us today. Today, we have Jesus, right? Everything that the altar, everything that the priesthood, the high priests in the Old Testament were supposed to represent were fulfilled in Jesus. Today, if you desire that intimate relationship with God, that covenant relationship with God, it can only be done through Jesus, through faith in Jesus and what he did for you, the ultimate sacrifice that he paid for you, so that it's not that God is forgetting our sin. It's not God is saying, oh, what sin? Yes, he forgets your sin, but not because you didn't do it. You still did the sin. You still broke faith with God. But the reason you're able to escape judgment is because Jesus took your judgment for you on the cross. He died for us and he rose again. He's still alive today at the right hand of the Father, making intercession for us. So that when you mess up, if you accept him as your savior, you're entering into a covenant relationship with God. When you make him your savior and you make him the Lord of your life and he cleanses you of your sin, does that make you totally and completely perfect? No, you're still human. You're still going to mess up. But as soon as you realize that you've messed up, that you have hurt God's heart, then you will be running to him quickly. He's plan A. You're running to him quickly saying, God, I messed up. Remember, I plead the blood. Remember the blood that was shed for me. Cleanse me with your blood. And Jesus is interceding for you at the right hand of the Father. He's your lawyer. He's your advocate. He's saying, he messed up. She messed up. But remember my blood, Father. Remember my blood. And that blood cleanses you of your sin. It pays for the mistake that you made, that you should be paying for, so that you are made right with God again. That's the God that we serve. This is not it. We can delve into further and further foreshadowings of Jesus. We're gonna be getting into that further, God willing. But we'll close the discussion here. So we're gonna move on to prayer requests now.